Picture this. There's a Rockefeller estate you've never heard of. Not because it was demolished, not because it was lost to time, but because the Rockefellers spent 100 years making sure you'd forget how it was built. Kickert, Dutch for lookout. Sitting on the highest point in Westchester County, New York, overlooking the Hudson River. 40 rooms of Renaissance Revival architecture. 6 stories of Indiana limestone and Italian marble. Terraced gardens that took 10 years to complete. A modern art collection worth hundreds of millions. Picasso tapestries, Calder sculptures, Andy Warhol portraits. And here's the part that makes absolutely no sense. It survived. While nearly every other Gilded Age mansion was demolished or sold, the Vanderbilt palaces on Fifth Avenue, the Astor estates, the Whitney mansions, this one endured. Built by the most hated industrialist in American history, it became a national historic landmark. The family that hired detectives to shoot striking workers now runs tours where visitors admire their art collection. How does that happen? If you enjoy long-form documentaries about America's forgotten palaces and the dynasties that built them, hit subscribe. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Do you think wealth built on violence can ever be redeemed? Because that question is at the heart of this story. The answer isn't about architecture or beauty or even money. It's about something far more calculated. 3 generations of Rockefellers understood that legacy isn't built in stone, it's built in time, and they had both. To understand how this palace survived, we need to go back to 1913, when the richest man in human history was also the most despised. John D. Rockefeller Sr. in 1913, 84 years old, worth $900 million. Let that sink in for a moment. $900 million in 1913 dollars. Adjusted for inflation, that's somewhere between 23 billion and 400 billion today, depending on how you calculate it. Some economists measure it as a percentage of GDP. At his peak, Rockefeller controlled nearly 2% of the entire American economy. That's not just wealthy, that's an empire. The source of that fortune? Standard Oil Company. By the 1880s, Rockefeller controlled over 90% of America's oil refining. Not through innovation, not through better product, through ruthless, systematic destruction of every competitor who stood in his way. Here's how it worked. Rockefeller negotiated secret rebates with railroads. His oil shipped cheaper than anyone else's. When competitors couldn't match his prices, he'd buy them out. If they refused to sell, he'd drop his prices below cost in their markets until they went bankrupt. Then he'd acquire their assets for pennies on the dollar and raise prices again. The technical term is vertical integration. The common term is monopoly. And Rockefeller didn't invent it. He perfected it with the precision of a man who kept ledgers tracking every nickel he'd ever spent. The public hated him for it. Newspapers called him a robber baron, an octopus strangling American commerce. Ida Tarbell's 1904 exposé in McClure's magazine documented his business practices in devastating detail. Muckraking journalists wrote headlines like, "The World's Richest Man" and "Most Hated." Anarchists sent death threats. After President McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist in 1901, Rockefeller began traveling with armed guards. He lived in genuine fear that someone would kill him. In 1911, the Supreme Court finally broke up Standard Oil under the Sherman Antitrust Act, splitting it into 34 separate companies. Ironically, Rockefeller owned stock in all of them, and the breakup made him even richer. But the hatred didn't stop. If anything, it intensified. Because in 1914, something happened that would define how America saw the Rockefeller name for generations. But before that, let's go back to 1893. That's when Rockefeller began buying land in Pocantico Hills, Westchester County, about 25 miles north of Manhattan. He'd eventually acquire 3,400 acres, creating an estate larger than some European principalities. Why this location? Simple. It was the highest point in the county. Perfect visibility. Anyone approaching could be seen from miles away. And it overlooked the Hudson River Valley. Breathtaking views, yes, but also strategic. High ground, defensible. A fortress disguised as a country retreat. The original house, built in 1902, was modest by Gilded Age standards. Rockefeller Sr. preferred it that way. He was famously frugal, kept meticulous ledgers of every expense, even in his 80s. Ate simple meals, wore plain clothes. The mansion wasn't for show. It was for safety. But his son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., had different ideas. Jr. understood something his father didn't. If you're going to be rich and hated, you might as well be rich, hated, and grand. Hiding made you look guilty. Building a palace? That was a statement. In 1906, Jr. convinced his father to rebuild. He hired the architectural firm Delano and Aldrich. Chester Holmes Aldrich would lead the design. The project would take 7 years. Cost $2 million in 1913, equivalent to roughly 60 to 70 million today. The result? A 6-story Renaissance Revival mansion. 40 rooms, 30-foot ceilings in the Grand Hall. Indiana limestone exterior, the same stone used in many Manhattan buildings. Italian marble inside, silk wall coverings, rare woods. Every detail chosen to signal permanence, taste, dynasty. But here's what most people don't notice. The walls are 3 feet thick. 3 feet. That's not an aesthetic choice. That's fortress construction. Those walls were designed to withstand explosives, to survive an anarchist bomb if one came. And given the climate of the early 1900s, President McKinley assassinated, labor violence escalating, that fear was entirely rational. William Wells Bosworth designed the gardens between 1906 and 1915. Terraced slopes descending the hillside in the Italian Renaissance style. Fountains, statuary, limestone walkways. It took nearly 10 years to complete. The effect was extraordinary. You could stand on the uppermost terrace and see for miles, the Hudson River glittering below, the Palisades rising across the water. Beautiful, yes, but also surrounded, controlled, secured. Kaikit wasn't just a mansion, it was a refuge for the most hated man in America, a place where he could finally feel safe. And then, just 1 year after it was completed, his worst fears came true. April 20th, 1914, Ludlow, Colorado. Coal miners had been on strike for months against the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, a company John D. Rockefeller Jr. effectively controlled through family investments. The miners wanted basic rights, an 8-hour workday, the ability to shop at stores other than the company store, freedom to live outside company housing, recognition of their union. The company refused. Tensions escalated. Miners and their families, evicted from company housing, set up a tent colony near the mine. On April 20th, the Colorado National Guard, which had been deployed ostensibly to keep peace but was effectively acting on behalf of the mining companies, opened fire on the camp. 20 people died, 7 of them children, burned alive when the tents were set ablaze. The event became known as the Ludlow Massacre, and John D. Rockefeller Jr. was called before Congress to testify. The public wanted answers. Did he know about the violence? Did he order it? Was he responsible? Jr.'s testimony was carefully scripted, coached by lawyers, parsed for plausible deniability. He claimed he hadn't known about the conditions, hadn't ordered suppression, had been misled by mine managers. But the damage was done. The Rockefeller name, already infamous for monopoly, was now associated directly with violence, with the deaths of children. Newspapers ran editorials calling for the family's wealth to be seized. Protesters marched outside Rockefeller offices in Manhattan. The hatred was no longer abstract, it was visceral. This is when the family hired Ivy Lee, a public relations pioneer who would essentially invent modern corporate communications. Lee's advice was radical for its time. You can't hide from this. You can't buy your way out. You have to change what people think when they hear your name. Lee staged photo opportunities of Rockefeller Sr. giving dimes to children. He organized philanthropic announcements. He crafted a media strategy that slowly, methodically began to shift the narrative from robber baron to philanthropist. But Lee told them something else too, something crucial. This will take generations. You're not rebuilding an image in a year, or 5 years, or even 20. You're building a legacy that will outlast everyone in this room. Junior understood, and he committed to exactly that. At Kaikit, he began the transformation, not of the building, that was already complete, but of its purpose. From a fortress built in fear to a laboratory for redemption. John D. Rockefeller Sr. moved into Kaikit in 1913. He was 74 years old. He would live there for 24 years until his death in 1937 at age 97. His life at the estate was remarkably austere given its grandeur. He played golf daily on his 9-hole private course. Golf was part of his longevity regimen. He supervised the groundskeepers obsessively, would correct a single blade of grass out of place. He ate simple meals: chicken, rice, milk. He slept in a modest bedroom. The mansion had 40 rooms of marble and silk, but Rockefeller's personal habits remained almost monastic. He rarely entertained. Security remained tight. The estate was refuge, not showpiece. One groundskeeper later recalled, Mr. Rockefeller would stand at the edge of the terrace for an hour, not moving, not speaking. I asked him once if he was admiring the view. He said, "I'm watching for them." I said, "Who, sir?" He said, "The ones who want to kill me." That fear never left him. Even as his health held, he outlived every business rival, every critic, every anarchist who'd threatened him. The paranoia remained. He died in 1937, having never publicly apologized for Ludlow, having never acknowledged that his fortune had been built on broken unions and crushed competitors. For Rockefeller Sr., Kaikit wasn't a triumph. It was a fortress where the richest man in history spent his final decades watching the horizon. But when he died, his son inherited more than an estate. He inherited a mission. John D. Rockefeller Jr. was 63 when his father died. By that point, he'd spent his entire adult life trying to do something his father never fully attempted: make the Rockefeller name mean something other than monopoly and violence. Junior's approach was systematic, methodical. He treated philanthropy with the same efficiency his father had applied to building Standard Oil. In 1926, he purchased the entire historic district of colonial Williamsburg, Virginia, restored it, turned it into a living museum of American history. Cost? Tens of millions. Result? The Rockefeller name associated with preservation, education, patriotism. In 1947, he donated the land for the United Nations headquarters in Manhattan. $8.5 million worth of prime real estate. The gift made global news. Suddenly, Rockefeller wasn't the man who'd suppressed workers. He was the man who'd given the world a home for peace. He expanded the Rockefeller Foundation, funding medical research, education, the arts. Over his lifetime, Junior gave away $537 million, more than his father had accumulated in the first place. And at Kaikit, he began filling the rooms with art. Not randomly, not as decoration, as evidence. Evidence that the Rockefellers were more than industrialists. They were patrons, cultured, sophisticated. The kind of family that belonged in history books not for Standard Oil, but for what they'd built with that wealth. His wife, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, had founded the Museum of Modern Art in 1929. She shifted the family's taste toward contemporary art, away from the old masters that Gilded Age families typically collected, toward the avant-garde. It was a signal. We're not stuck in the past, we're building the future. Junior kept his father's bedroom unchanged for years after his death. Friends recalled him walking the estate grounds with advisors, discussing which cultural institution to fund next. His children remembered him as distant, always working on the projects. He hosted small, purposeful gatherings at Kaikit, never lavish parties, always strategic meetings. In letters, he wrote constantly about stewardship, obligation, duty. The burden of guilt was visible in every line. "I cannot escape the feeling," he wrote in 1915, "that the wealth we enjoy was purchased at terrible human cost. What do we owe?" His answer was, everything. Give it all back. Not in money, but in institutions. Libraries, universities, museums, medical centers. Build things that would last longer than the family, that would mean something beyond the balance sheet. By 1960, when Junior died, the transformation was largely complete. Say Rockefeller to an American in 1960, and they'd think of Rockefeller Center, the Museum of Modern Art, Colonial Williamsburg, the United Nations. The public schools and libraries and hospitals built with foundation grants. They might not think of Ludlow at all. That was the victory. Not forgetting, but replacing. New memories crowding out the old. But it was Junior's son Nelson who would complete the transformation in a way neither father nor grandfather could have imagined.
Nelson Rockefeller inherited Kaikit in 1960. He was 52 years old. He'd been governor of New York since 1959. He'd serve until 1973, then become vice president under Gerald Ford from 1974 to 1977. Nelson had grown up surrounded by art. His mother, Abby, had been a founder of MoMA, one of the most important cultural institutions in America. When she died in 1948, Nelson took it personally. He'd always loved art, but after her death, collecting became almost compulsive, an homage, a way to prove that her vision, that the Rockefellers could be defined by culture, not just capital, had been right. At Kaikit, Nelson transformed the estate into something unprecedented, a showcase for modern art in a historic setting. He commissioned tapestries from Pablo Picasso. The centerpiece, Mother and Child, stretched 70 feet across one wall. Estimated value today, based on auction comparables for similar Picasso works,
$50 million or more. That's one piece. He filled the terraces with sculpture, Alexander Calder mobiles, Isamu Noguchi stone pieces, Henry Moore bronzes. The gardens his grandfather had built as safe refuge became an outdoor gallery where abstract forms played against Renaissance terraces. Inside, he hung Andy Warhol portraits of himself. Pop art self-mythologizing. Nelson understood what his father and grandfather hadn't quite grasped. In the second half of the 20th century, art conferred legitimacy in ways business never could. He converted the coach barn, originally built for carriages and cars, into an underground gallery. Walk through the entrance and you descend into a space that feels like a museum. 200 pieces, climate-controlled, track lighting. Picasso ceramics, Buddhist sculptures, modern paintings. The effect is stunning. You're underground, beneath a Gilded Age estate, surrounded by the most cutting-edge art of the 20th century. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Standard Oil money, built on 19th century industrial capitalism, on suppressing unions and crushing competitors, now funding Picasso and Warhol. The art that had challenged capitalism, that had broken every convention, now collected by the ultimate capitalist dynasty. Nelson understood that irony. He embraced it. As he told one art dealer, "When I look at these pieces, I don't see investment. I see proof that we're more than what we were." He used Kaikit as a political base. World leaders helicoptered in for private meetings. Policy was discussed over lunch on the terrace, with Calder sculptures as backdrop. Nelson's governorship, his vice presidency, they were all connected to the estate. The art gave him cultural credibility. The historic setting gave him gravitas. Together, they made him more than just another rich politician. But by the mid-1970s, there was a problem. Operating costs for the estate exceeded $1 million per year. Property taxes, maintenance, staff, heating 40 rooms, preserving 200 pieces of museum-quality art. It was unsustainable, even for the Rockefellers. Nelson's brothers wanted to sell, liquidate, turn it into cash. But Nelson refused. This wasn't just a house. It was the culmination of 3 generations' work. His grandfather had built the fortress, his father had begun the transformation, and Nelson had completed it. If it was sold, that legacy ended. The estate would become condos or a corporate retreat or, worst case, be demolished for the land value. Nelson needed a solution, and in 1976 he found one. In 1976, Nelson Rockefeller was 68 years old. He'd had heart problems. He knew his time was limited, and he knew that without his personal will to keep it, Kaikit wouldn't survive. So he negotiated with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The terms were elegant. The Rockefeller family would retain life tenancy. They could live there as long as any family member was alive. But after the last family member's death, the estate would open to the public. The National Trust would manage operations, handle costs, preserve both the house and the art collection as a unified whole. It was precedent-setting. Few families had the wealth or the foresight to set up this kind of institutional framework. The Vanderbilts hadn't. The Astors hadn't. When their heirs couldn't afford the estates, the mansions were demolished. Entire blocks of Fifth Avenue palaces torn down in the 1920s and 30s to make room for apartment buildings. But the Rockefellers had something those families hadn't: time and strategy. 3 generations had built cultural assets: the art collection, the gardens, the reputation for philanthropy that made preservation justifiable. Nelson died in 1979. He was 70 years old. He suffered a heart attack in his Manhattan townhouse. The circumstances were slightly scandalous. He was with his mistress at the time, not his wife. But the scandal was brief. By that point, the Rockefeller name had been so thoroughly rehabilitated that one personal indiscretion barely registered. His brothers inherited the estate, but none of them wanted to live there. They honored the National Trust Agreement. The estate remained closed to the public while final details were resolved, family collections catalogued, preservation plans finalized. In 1994, 15 years after Nelson's death, Kykit opened for public tours. Operated by Historic Hudson Valley, a preservation organization. The tours cost $30 to $45. You can walk through the rooms where 3 generations of Rockefellers lived. See the Picasso tapestries, the Calder sculptures, the Warhol portraits. Stand on the terraces where John D. Sr. watched for assassins and Nelson entertained heads of state. Since 1994, over 250,000 people have visited. They admire the architecture, the gardens, the art. They take photographs of the Hudson River views. They buy souvenirs in the gift shop. Most of them have no idea what Ludlow was, or what Standard Oil did to its competitors, or how many men died building the wealth that built this palace. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Kykit survived because of the art collection. Not the architecture, though the architecture is beautiful. Not family wealth alone. Plenty of wealthy families lost their estates. Not even the philanthropy, though that helped rehabilitate the name. It was the art that made preservation justifiable. Museum-quality modern art displayed in situ in a historic mansion. That combination created cultural significance that transcended the family. Compare it to the Vanderbilt mansions, the Breakers in Newport. That survived because it became a museum early. But Cornelius Vanderbilt II's mansion on Fifth Avenue? Demolished in 1927. Why? No art collection, no cultural assets beyond the building itself. And once the family couldn't afford it, there was no institutional reason to preserve it. Or look at the Frick collection. Henry Clay Frick was as hated as Rockefeller. His role in the Homestead Strike of 1892 killed 10 people. But Frick's art collection went to a museum. His mansion became the Frick Collection in 1935, 2 years after his death. It survived because of the art. But the family itself largely disappeared from public consciousness. Kykit was different. The art stayed with the house. The family stayed with the narrative. 3 generations built not just a collection, but a story. We were bad, we became good, and here's the proof. The National Trust could justify preservation because the estate served a public purpose. It wasn't just a rich family's house. It was a museum, an educational resource, a testament to American art patronage in the 20th century. Operating costs that had been a burden to the family became reasonable when framed as museum expenses. The $1 million+ per year? That's what it costs to run a museum of this caliber. And museums get grants, donations, ticket revenue. Suddenly, survival wasn't about family money. It was about institutional sustainability. This is the mechanism that saved Kykit. And it's the mechanism that almost no other Gilded Age family had access to. Because it required 3 things most families didn't have. First, enough wealth to outlast the initial crisis. The Vanderbilts lost their fortune in 2 generations. The Rockefellers kept theirs. Second, strategic patience. Ivy Lee told them in 1914 that rehabilitation would take generations. They committed to it. Most families didn't have that long-term discipline. Third, cultural assets. The art collection created institutional justification for preservation. Without it, Kykert would have been just another mansion. With it, it became historically significant. When you visit Kykert today, you're not just seeing architecture. You're walking through a successful, century-long public relations campaign. Every room tells a story the family wanted told. The Picasso tapestries say, "We're cultured." The Calder sculptures say, "We're forward-thinking." The preserved gardens say, "We're stewards, not exploiters." And here's the most remarkable part. It worked. Let's talk about why nearly every other Gilded Age mansion fell. First force, economic pressure. Property taxes, operating costs, staff salaries. Maintaining a 40-room mansion costs millions per year. When families lose their wealth, the estates become impossible to sustain. The Vanderbilts are the textbook case. Cornelius Vanderbilt's fortune in the 1870s was one of the largest in America. By the 1970s, there wasn't a single millionaire in the family. The mansions were sold or demolished because no one could afford them. Second force, social pressure. Labor movements, changing attitudes toward wealth inequality, guilt. After World War II especially, ostentatious displays of private wealth became socially unacceptable. Grand estates looked grotesque. Families felt pressure to sell, to donate, to distance themselves from Gilded Age excess. Better to live modestly and quietly than to defend a palace. Third force, institutional void. Even if a family wanted to preserve an estate, there was no clear mechanism. Museums didn't want houses, they wanted collections. Historic societies had limited funding. Government agencies moved slowly. By the time anyone figured out preservation, the estate was usually gone. Kykert survived because the Rockefellers neutralized all three forces. Economic pressure? They maintained enough wealth across generations to outlast the crisis point. Diversified investments, trust funds, ongoing foundation income. While other families spent their fortunes in 1 or 2 generations, the Rockefellers preserved theirs. Social pressure? The philanthropy campaign neutralized it. By 1960, criticizing the Rockefellers felt like criticizing libraries and medical research. They'd built too much public good to be dismissed as robber barons. Institutional void? The National Trust Partnership solved it. A clear framework, professional management, public access. The estate became an institutional asset, not a private burden. But here's the uncomfortable question. Should it have survived? 20 people died at Ludlow, 7 of them children. 11 total children, if you count those who died from exposure after the tents burned. Standard Oil's monopoly destroyed countless competitors, ruined families, concentrated wealth in ways that took antitrust legislation to break. The Rockefeller fortune was built on suppressed wages, union busting, ruthless efficiency that treated human beings as inputs in an economic calculation. And now you can pay $45 to tour the mansion that fortune built. You can admire Picasso tapestries. You can take selfies with Calder sculptures. You can buy a souvenir book about the gardens in the gift shop. Is that redemption? Or is it erasure? The honest answer is Probably both. 3 generations of strategic philanthropy did genuine good. Colonial Williamsburg preserves American history. The Rockefeller Foundation has saved millions of lives through medical research. The Museum of Modern Art has shaped how we understand 20th century culture. The UN, whatever its flaws, was built on land the Rockefellers donated. That good is real. It's not cancelled out by Ludlow. But Ludlow isn't cancelled out by the good either. What Kikuit represents is something more complicated than good or evil. It represents the possibility that legacy is negotiable, that with enough time, enough resources, enough strategic patience, you can reshape how history remembers you. The Rockefellers had all 3. Most people, most families don't. If you're a coal miner's family from Ludlow in 1914, you don't get to rehabilitate your legacy. You don't have foundations and art collections and PR campaigns spanning 3 generations. Your story is fixed. Your tragedy is permanent. But if you're John D. Rockefeller, you can hire Ivy Lee. You can fund museums. You can fill a mansion with Picassos. And eventually, people forget to ask where the money came from. Is that fair? No. But fairness isn't the point. The point is that legacy is built by those who have the resources to build it. And the Rockefellers understood that better than almost anyone. Kikuit still stands. Historic Hudson Valley operates tours year-round, spring through fall typically. The estate is immaculate. The gardens are pristine. The art collection is properly conserved, humidity and temperature controlled, insurance and security in place. On a nice Saturday in October, tour groups walk through the mansion. A guide explains the architecture, the family history, the significance of each piece of art. Visitors take photos of the Hudson River views. They marvel at the Picasso tapestry. They ask questions about Nelson's political career, about the gardens, about whether the Rockefellers ever come back to visit. Sometimes someone asks about Standard Oil. Sometimes someone mentions Ludlow. The guides are trained to acknowledge it. Yes, the family's wealth came from controversial business practices, but they spent decades trying to give back through philanthropy. It's not evasion exactly, it's framing. The story told at Kikuit is a story of redemption, from fortress to museum, from fear to cultural legacy, from robber barons to art patrons. And for most visitors, that story is enough. Because standing in those rooms, looking at that art, walking those terraces, it's beautiful. And we want to believe that beauty can redeem what was ugly, that time can heal what was broken, that legacy is something we can build, not just inherit. Maybe the Rockefellers were right. Maybe 3 generations is long enough to transform guilt into grandeur. Maybe strategic patience, cultural investment, and institutional frameworks really can outlast memory of violence. Or maybe we're all just walking through a very expensive, very successful rebranding campaign. A century-long advertisement for the idea that wealth can wash itself clean if you just wait long enough. The truth is probably somewhere in between, because that's where truth usually lives, not in clean moral certainties, but in the uncomfortable space between what we did and what we became, between the fortress we built from fear and the museum we call it now. Kikuit survived, but survival isn't the same as innocence, And legacy isn't the same as justice. It's just what we call it when the story outlasts the storyteller. When stone and art and carefully cultivated reputation become the only things left to judge. The Rockefellers built their fortress well, not just with 3-foot thick walls to keep assassins out, but with layers of philanthropy and culture and time, to keep the questions from getting too close to the center. And it worked. 130 years later, we tour their mansion. We admire their taste. We marvel at how it survived when everything else fell. Maybe that's the real lesson. Not that wealth can be redeemed, but that if you have enough of it, you get to write the ending. Thank you for watching. If you want to choose which estate I cover next, there's a poll in the Community tab. Drop a comment below. Do you think the Rockefellers successfully rehabilitated their legacy, or is Kikuit just a beautiful monument to blood money? I genuinely want to know what you think.